The morning we buried my father, the church smelled of lilies and cold rain, and I remember thinking that he would have hated the lilies. He had been a man of pine sap and lake water and wood stove smoke, and the heavy perfume of those funeral flowers seemed to me a kind of insult to a life he had built with his own quiet hands. I sat in the front pew with my husband's arm around my shoulders, and I listened to the pastor speak words that were kind enough, but not quite true. And across the aisle, my younger brother sat with his wife and stared straight ahead as if he were already counting something. I remember the church itself almost more clearly than the words spoken in it. It was the same small white clapboard church my father had been baptized in 81 years before. The same church where he had married my mother on a Saturday afternoon in 1965. The same church where I had stood in a stiff white dress at 12 and recited the Apostles' Creed in front of the whole congregation while my father watched from the third pew with his hands folded over his Sunday hat. The pews were oak, darkened by a century of palms and elbows. The hymnals were the green ones with the cracked spines and the page corners turned down at How Great Thou Art, and In the Garden, because those had always been my mother's favorites. The radiators along the side walls clanked the way they had clanked when I was a child. A low tin clatter that came up from the basement furnace whenever the wind shifted, and at one point, during the eulogy, a draft moved through the rafters, and the lilies swayed, and I had the strange and quiet thought that my father would have liked the draft, if not the flowers. The eulogies were the part I had dreaded most, and the part that, in the end, did the deepest small damage. The pastor went first. He spoke for about 10 minutes, in a careful, even voice, about a man he had known only in the last 5 years of his life, a man who had attended church most Sundays and sat in the same back pew and slipped a folded $10 bill into the collection plate every week without fail. He called my father a quiet pillar of the community. He said my father had been a man of few words and many kindnesses. That was the public farewell to a man who had once held me in the lake water and whispered, "Just a little farther," for an entire August. I watched my brother across the aisle during the prayer, and I saw his eyes move. He was looking, I realized after a long second, at the casket, but not in the way a son looks at a father. He was looking at it the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he has just inherited and is calculating whether to keep or sell. His eyes moved up and down the length of the pine box once, twice, the second time more slowly, and then they slid sideways to Marlene, and her eyes met his, and something small and bright passed between them that was not grief. It was, if I had to name it now, the look of two people who had already finished a conversation. I saw it. I did not understand it yet. But I saw it, and the seeing of it has stayed with me, the way certain photographs stay even after you have torn them up. After the service, we stood on the church steps in the cold drizzle, and people came up and took my hand. Old men in feed store caps, women my mother's age in dark wool coats, the woman who had run the diner since I was a child, the postmaster, the man who had repaired my father's tractor twice a year for 40 years. They each said the same handful of small ordinary sentences, and each sentence was a small ordinary kindness, and I held on to them. There is a kind of grief that is held up only by the small ordinary kindnesses of strangers who knew the dead. And I have come to believe that the people who think those kindnesses are clichés have not yet stood on a church step in a cold rain. My brother stood about 10 feet away, near the parked hearse, and he shook hands with the same people I shook hands with, but his handshakes were brief. His hand went out, the other person's hand went out. The grip happened. The hand came back. The next person stepped up. His face never changed. Marlene stood beside him with her hand resting on the small of his back as if she were keeping him from drifting, and at one point I saw her glance at her watch. The wake was held at my father's house, the small clapboard place at the edge of town, because that was the way it had always been done in our family. The neighbor women had laid out a long table of casseroles and ham, and yeast rolls and a plate of brownies somebody's grandchild had baked. People moved through the rooms, speaking quietly, and looking at the framed photographs on the walls. I stood in the kitchen, mostly, because the kitchen was where my father had lived. His coffee mug was still in the dish drainer, where he had set it the morning before he died. I had not moved it. I have not moved it to this day. He had died in his own bed, in the small clapboard house at the edge of town, with the window cracked open the way he liked it, even in October, and he had gone in his sleep, which was the only mercy I could find in any of it. My mother had been gone 12 years already, and so for 12 years I had driven the 40 miles every Sunday to sit with him at his kitchen table and drink black coffee and listen to him tell the same 3 stories about the war and the lake and the year he built the cabin with his own 2 hands. I never minded the repetition. There are people, I think, who measure love in novelty, in surprise, in the next clever thing said over the next bright dinner table. And there are other people who measure love in the willingness to hear the same story for the 100th time and laugh at the right moment because the man telling it needs you to. I had become the second kind of person somewhere along the way. Maybe my mother had taught me. Maybe the cabin had taught me. Maybe I had simply learned, sitting across from my father year after year, that a story told the same way every time is a kind of prayer, and that the proper response to a prayer is not editing. The cabin, that is where this whole thing has to begin, because the cabin was the heart of him, and what they tried to do with it was not just a theft of property, but a theft of the man himself. He had built it in 1972 on a piece of shoreline he bought for almost nothing back when nobody wanted lake property in our part of the country. He cut the timber himself from the back acres, dragged the logs out with a borrowed tractor, and laid every course of that wall by hand over 3 summers. The porch faced west so he could watch the sun set across the water, and the dock he hammered together out of cedar planks and creosoted posts was the same dock my children had learned to fish from, and his children before them. It was a small place, 2 rooms and a loft, and a wood stove in the corner and a hand pump at the kitchen sink. But it was the truest thing he ever made, and he had told me 100 times, with his pipe smoke curling up into the rafters, that the cabin was mine. Mine. He always said it like that, with a small, firm nod, as if he were closing a door behind the words. I had been 1 year old the summer he started clearing the lot, and 4 years old when the roof finally went on, and so the cabin had been a fact of my life almost from the beginning. I learned to walk on its floorboards. I learned to swim from its dock, my father standing waist-deep in the cold lake water with his big freckled hands held out toward me, calling, "Just a little farther, just a little farther," and never once letting me believe he would let go. I learned to read on the braided rug in front of its wood stove, lying on my stomach with a flashlight after the lanterns were turned down, my father in the rocking chair behind me, reading his own book with a glass of dark beer beside him. I learned to gut a fish on the porch step, with a paring knife held in my small, uncertain hand, and his big, patient hand laid loosely over mine. I learned in that cabin what a quiet man looks like when he is happy. There are 3 afternoons in particular that come back to me now, and I will set them down here, because the cabin was made of those afternoons, and so was I, and you cannot understand what was taken from me unless you understand what had been given. The first was the summer I turned 7. My father had decided I was old enough to learn to split kindling, which was a job that had been done for years by him alone, and which he had now, in his quiet way, deemed important enough to pass along. He took me out behind the cabin to the woodshed where the splitting stump sat, a section of oak about 2 feet across, with 100 small bright cuts in its top from 100,000 strikes of his hatchet. He showed me the hatchet. It had a hickory handle worn smooth by his hand, and the head was a deep gunmetal gray with a fine edge he honed every Sunday morning on a small whetstone in the kitchen. He told me to set my feet shoulder width apart. He told me to hold the hatchet low on the handle. He told me to look at the spot on the wood where I wanted the blade to land, and to keep looking at that spot because the hatchet would go where my eyes went. He set up a piece of dry pine on the stump, a piece about as thick as my wrist, and he stepped back. I swung. I missed. The hatchet skipped off the side of the stump and clattered into the dirt. I was mortified. I was certain he would be angry. He was not. He picked the hatchet up and he handed it back to me, and he said, "Hatchets bounce. That's why you stand the way I told you. Try again." I tried again. I missed again. I tried a 3rd time. The blade bit. The pine split clean down the middle, 2 halves falling away on either side, and the inside of the wood was bright cream yellow and smelled sweet and resinous. And I looked up at my father with my mouth half open in surprise, and he had been watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, and have only ever seen on it since when I have done some small good thing that he had taught me to do. He said, "There you go. Now do another one. We need a wheelbarrow full before supper time." I split kindling for 2 hours that afternoon. My hands blistered. I did not stop. I have split my own kindling every winter of my adult life. I have never once swung an axe without hearing him say, "Hatchets bounce." The 3rd was the summer I was 12, the summer he built the loft. The cabin had until then been a single open room with the bed in the corner and a curtain drawn across it for privacy when guests came. My father had decided that I was getting old enough to want my own room, and so without telling anyone, between Memorial Day and the 4th of July, he framed in a loft above the kitchen end of the cabin and put down a tongue-and-groove pine floor and built a railing along its open side and cut a small dormer window in the south slope of the roof. I came up to the cabin the weekend after the 4th, and he met me at the door with a sheepish small smile, and he said, "I made you something." He led me up the new ladder he had cut into the wall studs. The loft smelled of fresh-cut pine, the way a new wooden boat smells when it has just been pulled from a builder's shop, and the dormer window faced the lake, and on the pine floor he had laid a braided rag rug my mother had made years before, and he had set up an old iron-frame single bed with a quilt my grandmother had pieced when I was a baby, and on the windowsill he had placed a small green glass bottle with 3 black-eyed Susans in it. And that was it. That was the room. He stood at the top of the ladder and he watched my face, and he said, "If you don't like it, I can change it." I could not speak. I climbed onto the bed, and I sat there with my hands in my lap, and I looked out the dormer window at the lake, and I cried, because at 12 I had not yet learned that a girl was not supposed to cry when somebody did something kind for her. He climbed up the rest of the way and sat down beside me on the bed, and he put his big freckled hand on the top of my head, and he did not say anything for a long time. After a while he said, "It's yours, you know, the whole place. I want you to know that." That was the first time he said it. He would say it 100 times over the next 43 years. I should have made him write it down. My brother Daniel had never cared for the cabin. He had never cared for the lake. He was 4 years younger than me, and from the time he was a boy, he had wanted out of our small town, out of the cold mornings and the muddy roads, and into something he called a real life. He had moved to the city at 19 and married a sharp, pretty woman named Marlene, and the two of them had built a life out of granite countertops and leased cars and a kind of bright, restless ambition that I had never been able to understand. They visited my father twice a year. They never once stayed at the cabin. I want to be careful here about how I describe my brother, because anger has a way of flattening a person into a cartoon. And Daniel was not a cartoon. He had been a soft, worried child, the kind of boy who cried easily and hid the crying behind his hand. And our mother had spent a great deal of her life trying to teach him that there was no shame in feeling things. Somewhere along the way, that lesson had failed to take. By the time he was 17, he had taught himself a kind of brisk, dismissive manner, a way of pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose and saying, well, that's just sentimental, that he wore like a thin armor against everything tender in the world. As a verdict, my father, standing beside her with his pipe in his hand, had said nothing for a long moment, and then he had turned and gone back inside, and he had not spoken to her again until dinner, and I had seen, that night, the first thin crack appear in something I had until then believed was solid ground. So when the lawyer called me 3 weeks after the funeral and said there was a meeting scheduled at his office to discuss the estate, I assumed it would be a small, quiet thing. My father had not been a wealthy man. The clapboard house in town, a little savings, the cabin, a pickup truck older than my marriage. I drove the 40 miles in a soft gray rain and parked behind the lawyer's office on Main Street, and when I walked into the conference room, I found Daniel and Marlene already seated at the long table with manila folders open in front of them, and the lawyer standing with his hands clasped at the head of the room. I want to describe that drive, because looking back, I think it was the last hour of my life in which I still believed certain things about my brother. The road from our house to my father's town runs along the river for the first 20 miles, and the maples on the far bank had just begun to turn, and the rain was the soft kind that does not so much fall as settle, the kind that beads up on the windshield without ever quite needing the wipers. I had the radio on low, tuned to the public station out of the county seat, and a woman with a calm, steady voice was reading a story about a man who had walked the entire length of the Mississippi River. I half listened. I thought about my father. I thought about the box of his pipes I had brought home from his kitchen drawer, 15 of them, mostly cherry wood, and the way they still smelled faintly of him when I lifted the lid. I thought about whether I should keep his red plaid hunting jacket or whether Tom should have it. I thought about which of his books I would take down from the shelf in his bedroom and which I would leave for the dust to settle on. I did not even once on that drive think about money. That, in retrospect, was my mistake. The lawyer was a man named Hollis. He had been my father's attorney for 30 years. He cleared his throat and would not quite meet my eyes, and that was the first thing that told me something was wrong. I had known Hollis since I was a girl. He had drawn up the deed on the cabin lot in 1971. He had handled the closing on my parents' little clapboard house in town in 1968. He had read my mother's will at her kitchen table in 2013 with his glasses sliding down his nose and his old hands trembling around the pages, and afterward he had stayed for an hour and drunk coffee with my father and not charged him for the time. He was 78 years old that autumn. He still wore the same brown suit and the same striped tie I remembered from my childhood. The numbers he showed me on a printed sheet were not catastrophic, but they were serious enough, and Daniel sat across the table with his rimless glasses catching the light, and his hands folded over his folder, and he told me, with the steady, reasonable voice of a man who has rehearsed his lines, that the only way to settle the estate was to sell the cabin. Quickly, for cash, to avoid the long drag of a tax sale. I noticed, in that moment, the small specific things about my brother that anger sharpens: the fresh haircut, the new wristwatch on his left hand, the way the cuff of his striped button-down had been turned back one neat fold to display it. Marlene's nails, freshly painted a glossy oxblood, resting on the manila folder as if to keep the folder from floating away. The pen lying on the table at his right hand was a black fountain pen with a silver clip, and it was, I realized with a slow cold tilt in my stomach, my father's pen. The pen my father had used to sign his Christmas cards every December for 30 years. The pen my father had used to write checks at the kitchen table while my mother stood at the stove. The pen had been on his nightstand the morning he died. I had not known anyone had taken it. I remember staring at him. I remember the small silver locket at my throat, suddenly feeling cold against my skin. I remember saying very quietly that the cabin had been promised to me, that our father had told me, told all of us, told Daniel himself in this very town more than once, that the cabin was to come to me. Daniel's mouth tightened. Marlene laid her hand on his arm in a gesture I had seen her use 100 times, the gesture of a woman managing her husband in public, and Daniel said, in that same reasonable voice, that promises were not paperwork, that what mattered was what the will said, that the will named the two of us as equal heirs, and that selling the cabin was the simplest way to be fair to everyone. Fair. He used the word fair. I asked to see the will. Hollis slid a copy across the table, and I read it slowly, and Daniel was right about the bare wording of it. The will did name the two of us as equal heirs. There was no specific mention of the cabin going to me. My father, who had told me 100 times that the place was mine, had apparently not put those words on paper. I remember a small, terrible silence inside my chest then. The silence of a woman who has just been shown that the man she loved most in the world had failed her in the one way that mattered. I did not cry. I have not been a woman who cries easily, not since my mother died, but I felt something cold settle into my hands, and I asked them, almost in a whisper, to give me a few days. Daniel said there was no time. He said the tax sale clock was running. He said a buyer had already come forward. A local man. Cash offer. $42,000. We could close within the week and clear the debts and walk away clean. $42,000. For a cabin on lake frontage that any honest realtor in the county would have priced at 3 times that, and that was before you counted the dock and the back acres and the timber. I told them so. I told them the number was a robbery. Marlene tilted her head and gave me a look of pity, the kind of look a woman gives another woman when she has decided that the other woman is being emotional. And she said that the market for rural cabins was soft, and that we should be grateful to find a cash buyer at all. I drove home that afternoon in the rain with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. My husband Tom met me at the door and saw my face, and did not ask any questions until I had taken off my wet coat and sat down at our kitchen table. I told him everything. He listened the way he always listened, with his big, quiet hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and when I was done, he said only, "Then we fight it." Tom and I had been married for 31 years that autumn. He had grown up 2 towns over from mine, the son of a dairy farmer who had lost the herd in 1982 and never quite recovered, and Tom had carried his father's quiet straight through to his own middle age. He worked as a foreman at the lumber mill out on the county road, the same mill that had milled the boards for my father's cabin in 1972, and there was a kind of slow rightness to that fact that I had been grateful for almost every day of my marriage. He did not raise his voice. He did not interrupt. When he listened to me, he listened the way a deep pool listens to a stone dropped into it, holding the ripples without complaint. And when he finally spoke, after my whole long broken story, he said the 4 words I had needed to hear, and only those 4 words. "Then we fight it." He did not say we will win. He did not promise me anything. He only said we would fight, which was, in the marriage we had made, his way of saying he would stand beside me, even if standing was all that was left. But there was nothing to fight with. I called 3 lawyers in the next 2 days. I told each of them the same story. They all said the same thing back to me. Without paperwork, a verbal promise from my father meant nothing. The will was the will. The estate had debts. If the executor, and Daniel was the named executor, wanted to sell an asset to settle those debts, he had the right. My only recourse would be a long, expensive court fight that I would probably lose. The 3rd lawyer was a woman about my own age named Patricia, working out of a small office near the county seat, and she was the one who said it most plainly. She sat across from me at her tidy desk with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and she said, "I'm sorry. I have to tell you the truth. The way the law works in this state, the will is the document. Anything else your father said is what we call testimony, and testimony from the dead is not testimony at all. Even if every neighbor in your county would swear under oath that he told them the cabin was yours, a probate judge would still side with the executor on a sale to settle debts. You could file an injunction. You'd lose it within 10 days. You could file a lawsuit afterward. You'd be in court for 2 years, and you would spend more in legal fees than the cabin is worth. And at the end of it, you'd still lose, because the deed isn't yours, and the will doesn't say it is." She had then taken off her glasses and looked at me with something that was not quite pity, but was very close to it. And she had said, "I'm sorry. Sometimes the law and the right thing are not the same thing." I cried that night. I cried for the first time since my father had died. Tom held me on our back porch, with the autumn wind moving in the trees, and I told him I felt as if my father had been killed a second time, and Tom did not try to argue me out of it. He just held me. The closing was set for the following Friday. Hollis's office. 10 in the morning. I drove the 40 miles again, and this time the rain had stopped, and the maple leaves along Main Street were burning red against a hard blue sky. And I parked behind the lawyer's office and walked up the back steps with my purse clutched tight in my hand. I want to tell you about the morning of that Friday, because mornings like that have a way of staying lit in the memory long after the days around them have gone dark. I had been awake since 4. I had not slept. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and I asked, of nobody in particular, that I would be given the strength to do whatever was about to be required of me, and that whatever was about to happen would happen the way my father would have wanted it to. I did not know that morning that he had already arranged everything. I dressed slowly. I put on the charcoal cardigan because it was the warmest, and the cream blouse my mother had given me my last birthday before she died, and I stood in front of the mirror in our bedroom, and I pinned the small silver locket at my throat. The locket holds a photograph of my mother on one side and my father on the other, both of them in their 30s, both of them smiling, and I had not worn it since the funeral. I wore it that morning because I needed them with me. I needed both of them with me. I went downstairs and I made Tom's lunch and put it in his pail, and I kissed him on the forehead in the kitchen before he left for the mill, and he held my face for a second between his big hands, and he said, "I'll be home by 4. We'll have supper." And I said, "All right." That was the whole of our conversation. He knew where I was going. There was nothing left to say. The drive out was the strangest part. I took the same road I had driven 100 times, the road my father had driven 1,000 times, and the morning light was a clear, hard October light that made every fence post and every silo and every red barn stand out as if it had been outlined in ink. I drove slowly. I did not turn on the radio. I had the windows cracked an inch because the heater was running, and I needed cold air on my face to keep my eyes open. I was on my way that morning to watch my brother dishonor him. I sat there for about 3 minutes. Then I put the car in gear and I drove on. When I came into town, the church bell was striking 9:45. I parked behind Hollis's office in a gravel lot that was already half full. I recognized the cars: Hollis's old gray Buick, Daniel's silver SUV with the city plates, a vehicle I did not know, an unfamiliar dark green pickup truck, parked at the back of the lot under a maple tree that was dropping its leaves onto the truck's hood 3 at a time. I stared at the green truck for a long second. I did not know whose it was. I would know within the hour. I want to describe Main Street that morning, because it was the same Main Street I had walked as a girl, and the strangeness of doing this on those particular sidewalks has stayed with me. The hardware store on the corner, where my father had bought the nails for the cabin in 1972, still had the same hand-painted sign in the window advertising stovepipe and snow shovels. The diner across the street, where my mother had taken me for grilled cheese after my piano lessons, still had the same pink neon coffee cup glowing in the window even at 10 in the morning. The little bookstore where I had spent my allowance on Saturdays still had a cardboard cat in the front display, the same cardboard cat that had been there since I was 9. 2 old men were sitting on the bench outside the post office in their feed store caps, and they nodded to me as I passed because they had known my father, and one of them said, "Sorry for your loss." And I said, "Thank you," and I kept walking, and I thought oddly that nobody on this street knew yet what was happening upstairs above the hardware store. Nobody on this street knew that my brother was upstairs selling my father's cabin out from under me. The town was going about its bright, clear, ordinary autumn morning, and inside one second-floor window, something quiet and ugly was happening, and the town did not know. The conference room door was closed. I tried the handle. It was locked. I stood there for a long moment with my hand on the cold brass knob. I could hear voices on the other side. Daniel's voice, low and steady. Marlene's voice, brighter, almost cheerful. A third voice I did not recognize, soft and slow. An older man's voice. And Hollis somewhere in the background, papers shuffling. I knocked. Nobody answered. I knocked again, harder this time, and after a long pause, Hollis opened the door a few inches. He would not let me in. He said, with a face that would not look at mine, that the closing was a private matter between the executor and the buyer, that as a co-heir my role was only to receive my share of the proceeds afterward, and that it would be best if I waited downstairs. I will not write here what I said to him. I am not proud of those words, but I left. I walked back down the wooden stairs and out into the bright, cold autumn morning, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost 2 hours, and I watched through the second-floor window the shapes of 3 men and 1 woman moving behind the frosted glass. I watched them sign their papers. I watched my father's cabin, the cabin he had built with his own hands across 3 summers in 1972, change owners without me in the room, and then I watched them come out one by one, Daniel first with a thick envelope in his hand, then Marlene, smiling at something on her phone, then Hollis, looking tired, and last the buyer. The buyer was an older man, tall, lean, silver hair combed neatly back. He wore a brown corduroy jacket over a plaid flannel shirt, and dark jeans and brown leather work boots, and he carried a worn leather wallet in one hand. He stopped at the top of the steps and put on a pair of tortoiseshell glasses, and for one long strange moment, he looked across the parking lot directly at me where I sat in my car. His eyes were a kind gray blue, not the eyes of a man who had just stolen anything, the eyes of a man who was sorry. He walked down the steps and got into a dark green pickup truck and drove away. I drove home in silence. I drove the 40 miles back along the river road, and I do not remember any of it, but I remember stopping on the way at the small turnoff above the dam, the place where as children we used to climb out and lean over the rail and watch the spillway, and I sat there for a long time with the engine running. The river was low that October, and the spillway was barely more than a thin curtain of white water sliding over the lip of the concrete, and the sound of it carried up through the open window in a low hush. And I think I sat there for nearly 40 minutes, although I could not say for sure. At some point, my phone rang. I did not recognize the number. I answered it because I was not thinking clearly, and a woman's voice on the other end said her name was Beth, and that she worked in the records office at the county courthouse, and that she was returning a call my father had made to her 3 months before. She said she had only just gotten the message off her old desk. She said my father had asked her to call this number, my number, in the event of his death, and to tell whoever answered that if they had any questions about a property recorded in October 1998, they should come down to the courthouse and ask for her by name. I asked her what she meant. She said she could not say more on the phone. She said it had to be in person. She said she would be in the office Monday through Friday from 8 to 4. And then she said very softly, "I'm sorry for your loss," and she hung up. I sat in my car above the dam with the phone in my hand for I do not know how long. I did not understand what the call had meant. I assumed it was something to do with the back taxes, or the lien on the house in town, or some old paperwork my father had filed and forgotten about. I thought, in my exhaustion, that it was probably nothing. I would later understand that the call had been the second tripwire in the careful machine my father had built. Walter had been the first. The records clerk Beth had been the second. There would turn out to be more. I did not speak to my husband when I came in. I went straight upstairs and lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The check from the sale arrived in the mail 4 days later. $21,000, my half, after the debts were settled. I put it in a drawer, and I did not cash it. 3 weeks passed. I want to tell you something about those 3 weeks. because they were the worst weeks of my life, worse even than the weeks after my mother had died, because at least then I had not been carrying anger. In those 3 weeks, I stopped sleeping. I stopped going to church. I stopped answering Daniel's calls. Tom watched me with quiet, worried eyes and made me coffee in the mornings and did not push me to speak. I drove out to the lake one afternoon and parked at the end of the dirt road that led down to the cabin, and I could not even bring myself to walk the last 100 yards. I just sat in the car with the engine off and listened to the wind in the pines. I think about those 3 weeks now, and what surprises me looking back is how small the days were. Grief tells you that catastrophe should make the world dramatic, that lightning should split the sky, that the weather should match the wound. It does not. The mornings were ordinary. I got up. I made coffee, the way I had made coffee for 30 years, with the small dented aluminum scoop my mother had given me when I left home. I put on my charcoal cardigan because it was warmer than the others. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the chickadees at the feeder, and I thought with a flat, empty surprise, I am still alive. The chickadees are still here. The coffee is still hot. And then I would do the dishes and feed the cat and walk down to the mailbox at the end of our gravel drive and bring up the bills and the catalogs, and the day would unspool itself with no particular regard for the fact that I had been broken in half. Daniel called 4 times in the first week. I let it ring. He called twice in the second week. I let it ring. He called once in the 3rd week, and that time I answered. And Marlene's voice was on the line instead of his, and she said, I just want you to know we feel terrible about how this all played out, and we hope you'll be ready to talk soon. Feel terrible. The phrase rolled around in my head for hours. Feel terrible, as if the cabin had been a chipped dish and not the heart of my father's life. I hung up without speaking, and I did not pick up the phone for the rest of the day. And Tom, when he came home from the mill, found me sitting at the kitchen table with the lights off, and the receiver still on the table beside the wall jack. And he sat down across from me without his coat off, and reached across the table and put his hand over mine. And we sat like that for a long time without speaking. And outside the window, the afternoon faded, and at some point, one of us got up and turned a lamp on. And at some point, one of us made dinner, and at some point, we went to bed. And I do not remember in what order any of those things happened. The grief had taken sequence away from me. I dreamed of my father in those weeks. I dreamed of him every night. He was always at the cabin in the dreams, always on the dock, always with his back to me, and when I called to him, he would turn slowly, the way an old man turns when his neck is stiff, and he would look at me with his soft, tired eyes, and he would say, I told you it was yours. Just that, every night. I told you it was yours. I would wake in the dark with my pillow wet, and Tom's slow, steady breathing beside me, and I would lie staring at the ceiling for an hour or two, and I would think, he told me it was mine. He told me it was mine, and now it is gone, and there is no fixing this, and I am a fool for ever having believed in a quiet promise from a man who is dead. I drove out to the lake one afternoon, as I said, and could not bring myself to walk down to the cabin. But I want to tell you what that drive was like, because it has stayed with me. It was the 3rd Wednesday after the closing, and the foliage along the lake road was past peak and going dull, and the cold had set in properly, the kind of cold that smells like wet bark and wood smoke and the underside of fallen leaves. I drove slowly. I had the heat on low. The county had paved the lake road only 3 years before, and the new asphalt still ran black and even under the falling leaves. and at one point a doe and her late fawn stepped out of the brush in front of me and stood a long moment in the road with their ears swiveled toward me, and I stopped, and they looked at me, and I looked at them, and I had the irrational thought that they had been sent by my father to see how I was doing. They were not, they were just deer. They moved on. I drove on. I parked at the head of the dirt track, and I rolled down my window, and I listened. And the wind was moving high in the white pines, and somewhere down at the water a single loon called once, and went quiet again, and I sat there for an hour, and I did not cry, and I did not get out. And at last I turned the car around, and I drove home. It was on a Thursday evening in late October, a little after 6, that the knock came at our front door. I was in the kitchen putting away dishes. Tom was in the living room watching the news. The porch light was on. I went to the door and opened it without thinking, and standing on the other side of the screen was the buyer. I want to be exact about the moment I opened that door, because I have replayed it in my mind, perhaps 100 times since, and the more I replay it, the more I notice that my body recognized him before my mind did. My hands had been wet from the dishwater. I remember wiping them on the front of my apron as I walked to the door. And I remember the cold draft that came in through the screen as I pulled the inner door open. And I remember the smell of the porch, of cedar and dry leaves, and the faint tang of wood smoke from someone burning brush down the road. I remember the porch light making a yellow halo around his silver hair. I remember the way his shoulders sat squared and patient under the brown corduroy of his jacket, the way an old soldier's shoulders sit when he has been waiting a long time and has not allowed himself to lean against anything. And I remember, before I had taken in his face or his hands or the envelope, that I felt a strange small lift inside my chest, the kind of lift you feel when a door has opened in a dream and you have been waiting for the door without knowing it. I did not understand the lift then. I only know now what it had been. He took off his tortoiseshell glasses and held them in one hand. In the other hand, he held a yellowed sealed envelope. The envelope looked old. The paper had gone the color of weak tea, and there was something written on the front of it in handwriting I knew at once, the neat, slanted handwriting of my father. The man on the porch said my name, not loudly, just my first name, the way someone says it when they have been thinking about you for a long time. He asked if he might come in. I think I nodded. I am not sure. Tom appeared behind me in the hallway, and I turned to him, and the man on the porch saw my husband and said, very gently, that he would prefer to speak to me alone first, but that, of course, my husband was welcome to listen if I wanted him there. Tom looked at me. I looked at the envelope. I said Tom should stay. We sat at the kitchen table. The lamp over the table was on, and the light fell warm and yellow across the wood. The buyer set his leather wallet down on the table and laid the yellowed envelope between us. He folded his hands on top of his wallet, and he looked at me with those kind gray-blue eyes. I noticed his hands. They were the hands of a man who had used them all his life. The knuckles were thick and slightly swollen, the way knuckles get from 40 years of cold work, and the backs of them were freckled with sun and faintly dusted with the small white scars that come from a lifetime of fish hooks and cedar splinters and the occasional bad pull of a handsaw. The right thumbnail was a little flat, as if it had been hit once with a hammer long ago and had healed crooked. His left hand wore a thin gold wedding band, scratched and dulled, and that ring told me without his having said a word that there had been a wife somewhere, that there might still be a wife, or there might not. but that whichever it was, he had loved her and was not the kind of man who took the ring off because it had become uncomfortable. I trusted him before he had spoken. That, I think, is something my father had counted on. He said his name was Walter. He said he had known my father for 43 years. I felt a cold thing turn over in my chest. He said he and my father had served together, briefly, a long time ago, and that they had stayed in touch after, and that for the last 20 years, they had fished together once a month at the cabin, every second Saturday, weather permitting. He said my father had spoken about me often. He said my father had been proud of me. He said my father had loved me very much. He told me other things too. He told me about the time my father had taken him out on the ice in February, 2 of them in heavy coveralls and felt-lined boots, and they had cut through 18 inches of black ice with a hand auger and pulled up 4 lake trout in 2 hours, and gone back to the cabin and fried them in butter on the wood stove, and eaten them with stale crackers, and felt richer than any king. Not in big speeches, Walter said, just in the small running way a man does when he is content. She drove all the way out today again. She brought me a pie. She fixed the screen door for me. I told her not to, and she did anyway. Walter said my father had said my name with a particular small softness, and I had to look down at my hands while he said this, because there is a kind of grief that opens up inside you when you learn, after a man is dead, that he had been carrying you in his mouth for years, like a smooth stone he was reluctant to set down. He said that 11 years ago, on a cold morning in March, my father had handed him this envelope. My father had told him that someday, perhaps soon, perhaps long after he was gone, somebody might try to sell the cabin. And if that day ever came, Walter was to step forward as the buyer. Walter was to offer cash, whatever it took to close the deal quickly. And then, only then, Walter was to bring this envelope to me and place it in my hand. I looked down at the envelope. My name was written on the front of it in my father's careful slanted hand, just my first name. Underneath it, in smaller letters, my father had written 4 words. To my daughter, from Dad. My hands began to shake. Walter said he was sorry it had taken him 3 weeks. He said he had wanted to be sure that the closing had cleared, that the deed transfer had been recorded at the county courthouse, that everything was on paper and final. Because what was inside the envelope, he said, would not work unless the sale had already gone through. I asked him what was inside. He said it was not his place to say. He said only that I should open it now, in front of him, because there were things in it that would need explaining, and he had promised my father he would explain them. I took the envelope in my hands. The paper was soft with age. The seal across the back was a circle of red wax, pressed with the shape of a small pine tree. My father had kept a wax seal in a drawer in his desk for as long as I could remember. He had used it on letters to my mother when they were courting, and on birthday cards to me when I was a child, and on the back of a folded piece of paper he had once given me on the day I graduated from high school. The pine tree seal. I had not seen it in 20 years. The seal sat heavier in my fingers than I had expected. The wax had gone a dark brick red, and the imprint of the small pine was still crisp. The 5 fanned branches and the narrow trunk and the tiny dot at the base where my father had always pressed a little harder so the seal would set. I remembered the seal itself, the brass thing with the wooden handle, the way he had warmed the stick of red wax in a candle flame and let 3 slow drops fall before pressing the brass down into the puddle. I remembered the smell of the wax burning. I remembered being small and watching him do it at the kitchen table by lamplight, and asking him why he sealed his letters this way when nobody else's father did, and his looking up over his glasses and saying, "Because some things are worth doing slowly." I had been 7. I had not understood. I understood now. I broke the seal. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a folded letter in my father's handwriting, 4 pages long. The second was a thicker document, official-looking, bound with a blue cover. The third was a smaller envelope, sealed with the same wax tree. I opened the letter first. I will not write the whole letter here. Some of it was for me alone, and I will keep it that way. But I can tell you the parts that matter to this story. My father wrote that he had known for many years that his children were not the same. He wrote that he loved Daniel, that he had always loved Daniel, but that he had watched Daniel grow into a man who measured the world in dollars, and he had grieved for that. He wrote that he had watched me, on the other hand, drive 40 miles every Sunday for 12 years to sit at his table and drink coffee with him, and he had not forgotten. He wrote that the cabin had always been mine, that he had told me so 100 times because he had wanted me to know it in my bones, but that he had also known, knowing his son, that a will alone would not be enough, that a will could be argued with, that a will could be twisted by a clever wife and a tired lawyer into something it was not meant to be. So in the autumn of 1998, 8 years after my mother died, my father had quietly created a separate trust, not a will, a trust, a revocable living trust, set up through a different lawyer in a different county, naming me as the sole beneficiary of the cabin and the surrounding 14 acres. The trust held the deed. The deed had never been part of the estate. The deed had never been Daniel's to sell. The thicker document under the blue cover was a certified copy of that trust, dated October 1998, notarized, filed with the county recorder. It named me by my full legal name as the sole owner of the property described as Lot 7, the cabin parcel on the lake. The buyer, Walter, had bought nothing. The deed Daniel had signed at that closing, the deed he had transferred to Walter for $42,000 in cash, had not been the deed to the cabin at all. It had been a quitclaim deed against the estate's claim, which the estate did not have, on a property it did not own. Walter had paid $42,000 of his own money to purchase a piece of paper that legally meant nothing. I lifted my eyes from the document and looked at him across my kitchen table. I could not speak. Walter said very quietly that the $42,000 had been my father's money, set aside in a separate account 11 years ago, and held in trust for exactly this purpose. He said my father had wanted the sale to go through. He had wanted his son and his daughter-in-law to sign the papers. He had wanted them to take the money and split it and walk out of that lawyer's office believing they had won. Because only then, my father had said, would the truth be unanswerable. Only then would there be no way for them to claim it had been a misunderstanding, or that they had not really meant it, or that they would have changed their minds if I had only spoken up sooner. My father, Walter said, had wanted to know. He had wanted to know whether his children would honor him or betray him, and he had set the test in such a way that the answer could not be denied. I asked Walter, in a voice that did not sound like my own, what was in the third envelope, the small one with the wax tree. He said he did not know. He said that one was for me alone. I set it aside. I would open it later, by myself, by lamplight in our bedroom, and what was in it I will not write here. It was a photograph of my mother and my father on the dock at the cabin in the summer of 1971, the year before he built it. And on the back of the photograph my father had written 4 words in his slanted hand. "This was always yours." We sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. Tom made coffee. Walter drank his slowly. He told us stories about my father I had never heard. The time my father had pulled a stranded canoeist out of the lake in November water. The time he and Walter had argued for 3 hours about the right way to split firewood, and finally agreed they had both been wrong. The way my father had spoken about me in those last years, as the one person in the world who had never let him down. I want to set down here a few of the journal entries I read in the days that followed, because they were the marrow of what my father had been thinking about me and about Daniel for 27 years, and because without them you cannot understand the patience of what he had finally done. The first entry I want to set down was from October of 1997. My father had written in his slanted, careful hand, "Took the boy out on the lake this morning. Tried to teach him to read the wind off the south point. He looked at the water for 10 minutes and then asked me how much I thought the cabin would be worth in 20 years if the lake were dredged for development. He is 23 years old. He is my son. I love him. But he is not a man of this lake. He is a man of someplace else, and I have to learn to let him be it." That was all. The entry was dated October 11th, 1997. He had written, had her here last weekend with the children, watched her set up the tent on the side lawn for the boys, watched her teach the older one how to bait a hook. She does it the way I taught her. She holds the worm gently, the way I showed her, and she tells the boy that the worm is alive and that he should respect it. She is 44 years old this year, and watching her on the dock today, I had to sit down on the porch step because my knees would not hold me. She does not know I watched her. She does not know I went inside afterward and stood in the kitchen with my hands on the counter and cried. Some days the gift of a child, outgrowing into the person you had hoped for, is more than a man can carry standing up. I read that entry alone. Tom had gone back into town for groceries. He had written, "Daniel called this evening. He has not called since Christmas. He wanted to know about the deed on the cabin. He asked, in a roundabout way, I am sure he thought I did not see through, whether the cabin was in the will or held some other way. I told him it was in the will. I lied to my own son, and I felt no shame about it, because I had already, 10 years ago, this October, taken steps to see to it that the lie would never matter." He thanked me, and he hung up. I sat for a while in the dark kitchen after the call. I thought about what kind of son asks his father a question like that. I thought about what kind of father has to lie to his son to protect his daughter. I thought about both of those things for a long time, and I did not come to any peaceful conclusion, and at last I made myself a cup of tea, and I went to bed. There were others. There were entries about my mother, about her last illness, about the morning she had died. He had simply, quietly, across 27 years, written down a life that had been lived honestly, and the daughter he had loved, and the son he had grieved, and the wife he had buried, and the cabin he had built, and the dock he had hammered together one cedar plank at a time. When Walter finally stood to leave, he reached into his leather wallet and brought out a small key on a leather fob. He laid the key on the table next to the trust documents. It was the key to the cabin door, the same key I had used 1,000 times as a child, the same key my father had pressed into my hand when I turned 16, and he told me, with a small, firm nod, that the place was mine. Walter said the cabin was mine again. He said it had never stopped being mine. He said he was sorry he had been the instrument of so much pain, but that my father had asked him, and he had loved my father, and a promise to a friend was a promise. I walked him to the door. The leather was soft and dark with age, and on the spine of each one my father had written a year. The earliest was 1982. The latest was 2009. 27 years. I opened the first one. The handwriting was the same slanted hand I had read on the envelope. The first entry was dated April 14th, 1982. My birthday, my 11th birthday. My father had written on that day that he had watched me run down the dock that afternoon and jump into the lake fully clothed because my brother had dared me, and that he had laughed harder than he had laughed in a year, and that he wanted to remember that laugh. And so he was starting this notebook to remember things in. I sat at the kitchen table in the cabin my father had built in 1972, and I read the first notebook all the way through, and then the second, and then the third. Tom made me a sandwich at some point. I do not remember eating it. When he finished, his hands were shaking. He looked up at me, and his hard brown eyes behind the rimless glasses were no longer hard. They were something else, something I had never seen in my brother's face before. He tried to speak twice and could not. I told him, very quietly, that the cabin was mine, that it had been mine since 1998, that he had sold a piece of paper that meant nothing, and he had taken $21,000 of his half of a sale that had never really happened, and he and Marlene had spent 3 weeks believing they had outwitted me and our father both. I told him our father had known. I told him our father had set the test, and I told him our father had failed him, in the end, because he had hoped Daniel would refuse. I told him I was not going to take him to court, not because he did not deserve it, but because our father had not wanted that. The trust had been the verdict. The truth was the punishment. I told him to give back the $21,000, every dollar of it, to Walter, who had paid the money in good faith. I told him I never wanted to see Marlene at the cabin again, and I told him that if he ever wanted to come back to the lake himself, alone, without her, just to sit on the dock and remember our father, he could. The door would be open. He cried then. My brother, who had not cried at our father's funeral, sat at our father's kitchen table and put his face in his hands and cried like a child. He paid Walter back. It took him a year, but he did it. Marlene left him 8 months after that, when she understood that the money she had counted on was gone, and that the cabin she had planned to flip was not coming. I cannot say I was sorry to hear it. Daniel calls me now once a month. We talk for about 10 minutes. It is not what we had as children. It will never be what we had. But it is something, and our father, I think, would have wanted us to keep something. Walter and I are friends now. He comes out to the cabin on the second Saturday of every month, the way he came out for 20 years with my father, and we fish off the dock, and we do not talk much. And that is exactly right. He is 72 now. He says he will keep coming until he cannot. The cabin is mine. The deed sits in a fireproof box in our bedroom closet, next to the photograph of my mother and father on the dock in 1971. The journals sit on a shelf I built above the wood stove. I read one entry from one of them every Sunday morning, with a cup of black coffee, the way my father drank his. My father had known his children. He had loved them both, and he had known them both, and he had built a quiet, careful trap 11 years before he died. Not to punish anyone, but to protect a thing that he had made with his own hands. and that he had wanted to leave to the daughter who had stayed. People ask me sometimes if I forgive my brother. I tell them the truth. I am still working on it. I had kept it through every flood and every winter and every careless summer, and the lures inside it were still wrapped in waxed paper, the same way he had wrapped them. I brought it down to the dock. I sat down beside Cora again, and I opened it. I told her the names of the lures, the daredevil, the hula popper, the mep spinner. She listened with her small face turned up toward mine and her thumb in her mouth, and I let her hold each one in her small palm. I tied a small yellow popper onto her line, the same kind of popper my father had tied onto my line when I was 7, and I stood behind her with my hand wrapped over hers on the rod, and we cast together. The line whirred out across the still water, and the popper landed 20 feet out with a small, clean plip, and Cora gasped, and I said very quietly, "There, that's how." She caught a sunfish about 10 minutes later, the smallest sunfish I have ever seen, no bigger than the palm of her hand, with a bright blue cheek patch and a tiny gold belly. I helped her bring it up onto the dock. She wanted to keep it. I told her, the way my father had told me, that the fish was alive, and that we should respect it, and that we should let it go. She thought about this for a long second. Then she nodded, very seriously, and she watched while I gently unhooked the small fish and slid it back into the lake. It hung in the water for a moment, surprised, and then it darted away. Cora looked up at me. Her face was very serious. He had meant it, and in the end, in his own quiet, careful way, he had made sure of it.